Wow, this guy Jim Jones, right? Totally random. I was reading his biography and it turns out he, lived with a Kennedy one summer. Crazy, right? There wasn't much info on how that happened, but still. Anyway, let's get into it. Jim's parents were Lynetta and James Jones. James was a World War I vet, getting disability payments because of a gas attack. He was supposedly emotionally distant, never really showing Jim any affection. Jim's mom, Lynetta, was a free spirit. She wasn't into religion at all. She called any god a sky god, which, is pretty funny. She just didn't believe in anything. And back then, that was not the norm for women. She was seen as the weird one, oh, don't go to her house, she doesn't believe in anything. Like having an opinion was a bad thing. She was also a bit of a loner, always working. People said she didn't have any maternal instincts and didn't even want kids. Then she got pregnant and had Jim, James Warren Jones, born May 13th, 1931. The family moved to Lynn, Indiana, and Jim described his childhood as loveless. His parents were never around, he was always alone, and they just didn't seem to care. His mom, who didn't want to be a mom anyway, was always working. His dad he was sick. Some say alcoholic, but I couldn't find confirmation on that. In high school, Jim was known for wearing his Sunday best almost every day, a pressed white shirt and nice slacks, the kind most people only wore to church. Church slacks, he wore them to school. Jim played some sports, even forming his own baseball team with the neighborhood kids. He wasn't great at the sports themselves, but he was a natural leader and organizer, which, is usually a good thing, but not in this case. As a teenager, Jim explored different churches. He went to as many as he could, just sitting in and listening to what they were preaching, trying to learn about all the different religions out there. There were a lot of them. Jim was on a quest to find the right religion or church where he felt he belonged. He carried a Bible everywhere and, as a teenager, preached on the street. At 17, he got a job at a hospital, which he described as a thriving experience, even though his tasks included cleaning up vomit, moving the deceased, and handling amputated limbs. This job sparked an interest in medicine. In 1948, while working at the hospital, Jim met Marceline, a nursing student. They dated, and Marceline was drawn to his caring nature and his belief in equality. They married in June 1949. Marceline had thought Jim was a Christian, but after the wedding she realized she didn't fully understand his beliefs. They argued about religion, but divorce wasn't an option in those times. Marceline decided to try to understand Jim's beliefs, or perhaps even convert him. Jim often took Marceline to local black churches. He said he was drawn to their energy. Unlike the white churches he'd attended, which he found boring and where people seemed obligated to be there, the black churches were full of vibrant singing, dancing, and joyful worship. He felt at home there. He and Marceline were welcomed with open arms at one church, and in 1952, at the age of 21, Jim was hired as a student pastor. He found his calling. After about a year, Jim grew frustrated with not being in charge. He decided to open his own church in Indianapolis. He enjoyed the freedom to preach whatever he wanted. At his church, he blended Christianity with New Age spirituality and radical social justice, attracting a loyal following. His congregation was racially integrated, which was unusual at the time. His wife, Marceline, worked alongside him, organizing schedules and planning services. The church thrived, and the building became too small. Knowing his low-income community couldn't afford a bigger place, Jim needed a new plan. Jim needed a better plan to wow the crowds. He decided to perform miracles. He'd call out to random people in the audience, commanding ailments like headaches and coughs to vanish. He started small, knowing people wouldn't believe him right away. He'd declare people healed, yelling healed with great fanfare, like a concert. Word spread, and people started coming. Then came the collection plates. Jim was making serious money. He occasionally did guest spots at other local churches, introducing himself to bigger crowds. He knew these new audiences wouldn't immediately buy into his healings, so he let a few close associates in on the secret. He'd bring friends from his own church and use them as audience plants, who would pretend to be suffering and then be healed. For example, a couple would stand up and say they'd had a heart defect and were now cured. It worked. His healings evolved from minor ailments to curing cancer. At one church, an audience plant supposedly cured would jump up and down celebrating, even though they never had cancer. This brought in even more money, allowing Jim to upgrade to a bigger building in Indianapolis. He called his church Community Unity, but the new building, a former Jewish synagogue, had temple carved into it, so Jim changed the name to People's Temple. At this time, Indianapolis was deeply segregated. Jim made it his mission to integrate the black community into all aspects of the city. He and his congregation would go to white-owned restaurants and shops, protesting for equality. Many owners refused service. Jim and his followers would then hold peaceful protests until the businesses gave in. Here's the interesting part. When businesses agreed to serve everyone, Jim promised them hundreds of new customers. He'd distribute flyers listing restaurants that supported them and welcomed black people. His members would frequent these businesses. The businesses benefited from this advertising, and word spread. Cooperate with Jim Jones and you'll make a lot of money. Jim's church members became valuable allies for local businesses. His followers were loyal customers. This is a side note. The story I'm telling you is vague. They would peacefully protest outside businesses, holding signs and advocating for equality. Jim was passionate and dedicated to this cause. He presented himself as a voice of reason, targeting businesses with discriminatory policies. He even preached about equality on the streets, something he'd done since his teenage years. In 1965, Jim, his wife Marceline, and their children, they had 4 by then, 1 biological, 3 adopted, moved to Ukiah, California. They invested in a new People's Temple. Around 50 to 60 members followed them. By 1969, the church wasn't as successful as Jim had hoped. He was discouraged, and his 20-year marriage to Marceline was strained. While Marceline focused on the children, Jim had an affair with a much younger church member. This went against everything he preached. He'd warned his congregation against infidelity. Fearing exposure, he confessed to Marceline. Marceline, who was often bedridden due to back problems, was unable to fulfill his sexual needs, he claimed. He told her he loved her and wanted to stay married, but needed this other woman for the sexual aspect of the relationship. Marceline, seemingly with no other options, accepted it. Her life revolved around the church and Jim, and she didn't seem to have anything independent set up for herself. Then Jim told his congregation. He was brutally honest, saying something like, "God is good, and so are 19-year-olds." His followers actually understood and supported his decision. The church had its ups and downs, but Jim persevered. By March 1970, he had a sizable following and was making good money again. He traveled with members to Los Angeles and Seattle, hoping to attract more people to the People's Temple. He'd set up temporary booths outside venues, giving sermons, selling photos of himself for $5, and performing healings. People talked about him. During these sermons, Jim had attendees fill out forms with their names and addresses, which he then used for marketing. Jim mailed pamphlets about the church and its miracles, soliciting donations. The People's Temple opened stores similar to Salvation Army or Goodwill, selling donated second-hand clothing. They served free meals in low-income areas and, impressively, funded college educations for teens who couldn't afford it, covering books, tuition, and even providing free housing and meals in remodeled dormitories. The People's Temple established permanent churches in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Many church staff members were dedicated followers. Jim instilled fear in his followers, claiming racists were trying to shut them down and threatened them. The prevailing mentality became, if you don't agree with us, we'll convince you. If we can't, you're the enemy. Sound familiar? Over time, Jim became increasingly controlling. He discouraged followers from activities not directly related to the temple, like going to the movies, suggesting they donate the money instead. Romantic relationships were discouraged as distractions. Drinking and drugs were forbidden as weakening. Couples who joined were allowed to stay together, but their time together was limited by temple duties. It sounds a bit like Scientology. His followers did whatever he asked. The People's Temple bought about a dozen buses for trips from San Francisco to Los Angeles and Seattle. Jim would appear at other churches, performing miracles and preaching about equality. The healings were a major draw, and he still used insiders as plants. Jim would also call out names from index cards, claiming the person had an undiscovered cancer. A temple nurse would then swab the person's throat, secretly inserting a bit of chicken liver. The person would gag and cough it up, and the nurse would present it as the cancer, declaring the person's life saved. He had his tricks. Around 1971, Jim began regularly abusing drugs. Jim used pills and liquids for energy boosts during the day and sleeping aids at night. His followers provided prescriptions. He initially hid his drug use, but soon became short-tempered with constantly red and watery eyes, leading him to wear dark sunglasses 24/7. He told his followers the sunglasses were necessary because his inner powers caused holy energy to glow from his eyes, which would burn them if they looked directly at him. They believed him. His drug use also increased his paranoia. He preached about the government being a threat, claiming the FBI and CIA were tapping their phone lines. He kept his followers in constant fear, believing they were targets. He'd say things like, "The Holy Spirit in my eyes will burn them, and we will be protected." The church members called Jim and Marceline Mom and Dad. The couple was frugal, never driving a new car. They had an old wagon, and only buying clothes from their own second-hand store. Jim claimed he wanted to show he was one of them, and that all the church money went back into the church. Jim's drug problem worsened, and he had numerous affairs with members, believing all women were attracted to him. Eventually, almost all women in his inner circle became his sexual partners, considering it their duty. Jim sought a promised land where his followers could live safely, away from the FBI and CIA. In October 1973, members identified Guyana, South America, as the ideal location. It was accessible by boat from Miami to Georgetown, Guyana's capital. Jim wanted complete isolation, and Guyana was perfect. Its population was around 850,000, mostly living along the coast. The majority of the country was dense jungle, with no roads connecting to the area where the People's Temple would be built. Jim told his followers this was where they would go to avoid American martial law and concentration camps, which he claimed were imminent. He instilled constant fear, saying the CIA and FBI were going to attack and kill them. In May 1977, Jonestown was open. Members slowly made their way there. There were cottages, but not enough for everyone. Followers helped build more, aiming to create a self-sustaining utopia. Jim controlled everything. No crop was planted, no tool purchased without his approval. Romantic relationships required Jim's permission, as did breakups. All incoming mail was read before delivery. Outgoing mail was censored. Anything negative about Jonestown was suppressed, and the writer forced to rewrite it with glowing reviews. When Jonestown was being built, Jim hyped it up to his followers, encouraging them to save money for the move. While many went, some chose not to. They believed in Jim, but they weren't forced. Privacy in Jonestown was non-existent. Cottages were overcrowded, and more people kept arriving with nowhere to stay. Water for showers was limited, and people were told to keep their mouths closed because it was polluted. Jim, meanwhile, lived in a nicer cabin with his wife and mistresses. They had a generator powering a refrigerator, fans, and his bedroom, plus soft beds. He also had a camp radio for making announcements, so he didn't even have to leave his room. Jonestown was funded by followers' social security checks. Money was tight, so many manufactured wooden toys to sell in Georgetown. This brought in some money, but not enough. Food was scarce. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches were the staple. Drinks were limited to water or Kool-Aid. Jim rewarded followers with a single cookie on Sundays. Rule breakers were forced to sleep and eat separately, run everywhere, and were ostracized. No one could speak to or even look at them. The population grew to over 900. Nightly meetings, sometimes with sermons but often with Jim's fabricated US and world news, lasted until 2 or 3 a.m. People worked until 6 p.m. with music playing. Jim grew frustrated with the lack of progress, and the followers were unhappy with the crowding, limited food, a single cookie, PB&J, and restricted beverages. Leaving wasn't easy. Passports were locked up and leaving required money, which no one had, as all income went to Jonestown. They were trapped. Some followers escaped, and others who could afford to leave signed contracts, vowing never to speak against the church. Those who escaped spoke to the media, leading to more negative press about Jim Jones and Jonestown. Jim, in turn, told his followers that troops were coming to take the children and that they had to fight. He twisted the news of the US investigation, claiming they were coming to kill everyone. His followers, isolated and only receiving news from him, were unaware of the outside world's concerns. Guns were smuggled into Jonestown. Jim created a security team, ostensibly to protect against attacks, but also to prevent people from leaving. In February 1978, Jim called an emergency meeting, claiming soldiers were coming to attack Jonestown within hours, intending to kill everyone, including the children. He told them that rather than be killed by these monsters, they should take their own lives, denying their enemies the triumph. Some agreed, while others wanted to leave. Large containers of a dark liquid were brought out, and everyone was told to line up and drink. Jim preached while they drank the poison, telling them their deaths would be peaceful. After everyone had swallowed, Jim declared it was a test of their loyalty. No one challenged him. This was the moment he knew he had complete control. Meanwhile, in the US, parents of Jonestown residents were concerned about strange or absent letters and pressured authorities to investigate. In November 1978, Congressman Leo Ryan traveled to Guyana to inspect Jonestown, investigating rumors of people being held against their will and subjected to abuse. Ryan arrived on November 17th, planning to return the next day. Jonestown residents were on their best behavior. As Ryan was leaving, several members asked for a ride back to the US, and he agreed. Jonestown security, believing these members were being taken, as Jim had warned, saw this as confirmation of the impending attack. The security team shot at the truck carrying the defectors, but they escaped. This created a sense of urgency. The defectors reached the airstrip, but armed security arrived and opened fire, killing 5, including Congressman Ryan and 3 journalists, and wounding 11. Around 4 p.m., Jim addressed his followers at the pavilion, telling them that one person on the plane was going to shoot the pilot, blaming Jonestown and bringing their enemies. He claimed he had a solution to spare the children from enslavement and the seniors from slaughter. He said it was time to drink the potion, not suicide, but a revolutionary act. Many refused. Some thanked Jim. All drank the flavor aid. The recording of this is horrifying and not recommended. The next day, the Guyana Defense Force found a horrific scene. Bodies were everywhere, some with injection marks. Jim's body was on stage. He and a mistress had died from gunshot wounds, not poison. Initially, the Guyanese government reported 383 deaths. After American troops investigated, the death toll rose to 909. Investigators found over 60,000 pages of documents and hundreds of tapes. They also found $700,000 in suitcases and numerous bank accounts with millions. Identifying victims took months. Some were identified by fingerprints or dental records, but many were too decomposed. 409 bodies were never identified and were buried in a mass grave in Oakland, California. All of Jim Jones' churches were seized and closed, and his bank accounts, holding over $7 million, were seized by the government to repay victims' families. Jonestown was the largest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until 9/11. Many victims' families sued the Jonestown estate and the government for failing to investigate earlier. Lawsuits also targeted church members. There's much more to the story, but that's the horrific tragedy of Jonestown. Jim Jones started with good intentions, seemingly wanting to help people. It seems money and drugs derailed him. Greed, money, and drugs can be a destructive combination. It's hard to believe such things could drive someone to do this. What are your thoughts? Thanks to Casetify for partnering on this video. Let me know who you want me to cover next week. Have a wonderful day and make good choices.